Welcome to this week's tutorial on using Articulate Storyline, where we're continuing our multi-part series on the Triggers panel. In our last video, we explored the Trigger panel and the Trigger Wizard, and walked through each of the actions in the Common section. If you missed that video or want a quick refresher before diving into this one, you'll find a link in the description below. These actions build on what we covered in the last video and give you even more ways to control what happens in your course. Today, we're taking the next step and focusing on the media and project actions, the triggers that help you manage audio, video, and overall course behavior. Let's get started. Just a quick reminder before we begin, you can open the Trigger Wizard by selecting the new trigger icon in the Trigger panel. Under the Media section, you'll find 3 available actions: Play Media, Pause Media, and Stop Media. Let's take a closer look at what they do and how you might use them in your course. The first action we'll look at is the Play Media trigger. As with most objects in Storyline, you can set a video or audio track to appear and start playing at a specific point on your timeline. But what if a learner wants to watch or listen to it again? Or what if you're creating a branching scenario where a learner answers a question and you want a video clip to play based on their response? That's where the Play Media trigger comes in. When you select Play Media, you'll tie the action to a specific audio or video file. This trigger gives you control over when and how your media starts, whether it's the first playback or a replay. Don't worry about the when and conditions sections just yet. We'll cover those in detail in a future video when we talk about how to make your triggers react to learner input. Both the Pause Media and Stop Media triggers will stop an audio or video file, but they're not the same. Remember in the timeline video, we talked about the play, pause, and stop icons in the bottom left corner? The pause icon stops the timeline and holds it at that exact point, while the stop icon resets the timeline back to the beginning. The Pause Media and Stop Media triggers work the same way. When you include a Pause Media trigger, Storyline will pause the audio or video right where it is. When the lesson starts the media again, it will continue from that same point. However, if you replace the Pause Media trigger with a Stop Media trigger, Storyline will stop the file and return it to the beginning. So when the lesson restarts the audio or video, it begins playing from the start. Here's a quick example. Let's say you have a branching scenario where a short video clip plays after each learner choice. If you want the learner to pause the clip midway to read additional information, you'd use the Pause Media trigger. But if you want them to be able to completely restart the clip from the beginning, for example, after reviewing feedback, you'd use the Stop Media trigger instead. Now let's shift to the Project section. Here, you'll find 3 available actions: Restart Course, Exit Course, and Complete Course. Realistically, you won't use these very often, especially if your course is being uploaded to an LMS, since most LMS platforms handle these functions automatically. The Restart Course action will return the learner to the very beginning of the course. You might use this if the learner failed the knowledge check 3 times and you want them to start fresh and review the material again. The Exit Course trigger and action allows the learner to close the course window and exit the lesson entirely. And finally, the Complete Course action reports that the learner has successfully met your learning requirements, either by passing a knowledge check or viewing a minimum number of slides. However, most developers rely on Storyline's built-in player reporting features to handle completion tracking instead of manually using this action. The next section is titled More. Think of this as the catch-all or miscellaneous section of the Trigger Wizard, the place where Storyline groups together actions that don't quite fit anywhere else. There are 8 actions in this section: Adjust Variable, Pause Timeline, Resume Timeline, Open URL File, Send Email to, Execute JavaScript, Send XAPI Statement, and Print Slide. Over the next few minutes, we'll take a closer look at what each of these actions does and how you might use them in your projects. I know we haven't discussed variables, what they are, or how to use them, and I understand that might make this section feel a bit confusing. Don't worry, we'll have a detailed discussion about variables in a future video. For now, just understand that variables are items that, depending on their programming and the course design, can change during the lesson. That change can be used to affect what the learner sees or does. There are 3 types of variables: true, false, number, and text. Each of these variable types behaves differently, and you'll see different options in the Trigger Wizard when you program them. Even though the available options will vary, the wizard itself will generally act the same for all three types. Let's look at what you'll see in the action section of the trigger wizard for each of the three variable types. We'll start with the simplest of the three, text. A text variable allows the learner to enter information that can be reused throughout the lesson, but it isn't used for any type of calculation or numeric manipulation. For example, let's say you want to create a dialogue between two characters, one representing the SME and the other representing the learner. You might have the learner enter their name at the beginning of the course, then use that text variable to display the name throughout the rest of the conversation. In the action section of the trigger wizard, the variable line might read, set text example to value blank, where text example is the name of your variable. You'll notice that the words value and blank are underlined, meaning they can be changed. If you select value, a drop-down will appear, allowing you to choose between setting the variable to a specific value or linking it to another variable. In this case, don't think of value as a number. Instead, think of it as a group of characters or text. If you choose variable instead, you can make this variable equal to another one. And whenever that second variable changes, this one will automatically update as well. Once the variable is set, either to a specific value or to another variable, Storyline can display that information throughout the rest of the lesson. Whether it's a learner's name, a text entry, or any other custom text you want to reuse. The next type is the true-false variable. This variable acts like a go, no-go checkpoint. The condition is either met or it isn't. Depending on whether the condition is true or false, Storyline will decide which actions to perform. Unlike text variables, you generally won't display a true-false variable directly to the learner. These variables work quietly in the background, controlling what the learner can see or do, based on their progress or decisions. For example, imagine the learner must complete a specific task before continuing. You could disable the next button until that task is done. Once completed, the variable changes to true, and the learner can move forward. But here's the key. If the learner later goes back to that slide, they shouldn't have to complete the same task again. The true-false variable remembers that the task was completed and keeps the next button active. This kind of logic gives the learner control and prevents unnecessary repetition, which helps maintain engagement. When working with true-false variables, you'll also see two options in the trigger wizard, set and toggle. Set assigns the variable to a specific value, either true or false, and toggle flips the variable's current state. If it's true, it changes to false, and if it's false, it changes to true. Just like with the text variable, you can set a true-false variable to a specific value, either true or false, or you can set it equal to another true-false variable. When that second variable changes, this one will automatically update as well. The number variable is the most complex, and honestly, the one that tends to intimidate people who didn't enjoy high school algebra. But don't let it scare you. Even though it's the most complex, it's also the most powerful type of variable. A number variable starts with a default numerical value, and then, based on how the trigger is programmed and how the learner interacts with the course, Storyline can perform simple addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division to change that value. Or, just like the text and true-false variables, you can assign it the value of a different variable. In our special tools and tabs video, we introduce sliders and dials, both of which use number variables. As you move the slider's thumb or the dial's pointer, Storyline automatically updates the variable's value based on its position. You can even use multiple sliders or dials together to create something like a Level 1 survey. Then, by averaging the values of those sliders or dials, you can display a final score or rating back to the learner using a completely separate variable. Let's take a look at how we can use these variables, and we'll use our slider example. We'll go back to the Special Tools and Tabs video, where we first talked about sliders. Visually, there are two parts to the slider, the thumb, shown here in red, and the track, shown in blue. As you move the thumb along the track, the slider's programming automatically updates its variable to reflect the current position. In the Slider Tools Design tab, you can see that the slider has an assigned variable named Slider Example1. You'll notice that this name carries over into the Trigger Wizard, where the initial value from the Slider's Properties section appears as the default value of 0. If you change the value in either location, the Properties panel or the Trigger Wizard, the other will automatically update as well. Now, I'm going to show you two short videos. You'll see two sliders that could be used in a Level 1 evaluation to measure how well your learners liked the training, along with a final average score of their responses. Each slider uses a Likert scale from 1 to 5, with an initial value set to 3. I've named the variables for these sliders Slider 1, 1 to 5, Likert, and Slider 2, 1 to 5, Likert. Then, I've created two additional variables, Likert sum and slider average. All four of these variables are number variables. An average, as you know, is the sum of the numbers divided by the total number of numbers. In this example, we'll first add the two slider variables together to get the Likert sum, then divide that sum by 2 to get the slider average. Let's start by using number variables to calculate the Likert sum. We'll set the first slider to 1 and leave the second slider at 3. The slider's programming automatically updates the variable slider 1, 1 to 5, Likert to 1, and slider 2, 1 to 5, Likert remains 3. Now, we need to program the math to calculate the sum of the two sliders' values. To do this, we'll add each slider variable to Likert sum. First, we'll change the action from set to add and switch value to variable. Notice how the trigger wizard's display changes, and Likert sum remains brownish-green, showing that this is the variable we're adjusting. Then, we select slider 1, 1, 5, Likert to tell Storyline to add its value of 1 to Likert sum. At this point, Likert sum equals the value of slider 1. We'll repeat the process with slider 2, adding its variable to Likert sum as well. Let's see how these two triggers work together. Now, we have a slider sum of 4, which makes sense. The first trigger took slider 1's value of 1 and added it to slider sum's initial value of 0, giving us a total of 1. Then, the second trigger added slider 2's value of 3 to the current slider sum value of 1, giving us a final sum of 4. Now, let's find the average. As before, the brownish-green color tells us which variable we're adjusting. This time, we want to change the slider average from its initial value of 0 to the final calculated value. To help demonstrate the process, we've added an additional step, assigning slider average to equal slider sum's value of 4. This lets us keep showing the sum while we calculate the average, and it also demonstrates that one number variable can be assigned to another. If you were building this in your own course, you might not need this extra step, but it's useful for showing how Storyline handles number variables. Now, we'll adjust slider average by dividing it by 2 to get the final value. Let's take a look at that in our second short video. Our next actions in the More section are pause timeline and resume timeline. These are used when you want the timeline to stop for a specific reason, maybe to give the learner time to complete an interaction or activity, and then continue or resume from that same point in the timeline. You may or may not use the Open URL or File trigger very often. Most developers add links to websites or downloadable files in the Player Resources tab, giving learners access to that information throughout the entire course. But what if you need the learner to complete a specific task or answer a question before gaining access to that website or file? In that case, the Open URL or File trigger might be the better choice. For example, imagine your lesson covers a task the learner must perform on the factory floor during an emergency. You want them to understand the process without referring to the written procedure, so the activity includes a knowledge check to verify what they've learned. You wouldn't want to include the full instructions in the Resources tab because learners could use them during the activity. Instead, if they don't successfully complete the activity or pass the knowledge check, you could use the Open URL or File trigger to take them to the procedure afterward, allowing them to review it before trying again. The Send Email trigger does exactly what it sounds like. It opens the learner's default email program so they can send an email. You'll enter the recipient's address in the trigger's email field, and the program will automatically populate the To line when the learner clicks it. If you need to send the email to multiple recipients, simply separate each address with a comma. JavaScript is the heart of most online applications, websites, and interactive programs. It's one of the primary languages that makes digital content dynamic and responsive. Hearing that, you might think, isn't that what triggers already do? Why would I need JavaScript? Storyline includes about 30 pre-built actions in the trigger wizard. But what if you want to create something that isn't on that list? That's where the execute JavaScript trigger comes in. It allows you to write custom JavaScript code directly in the trigger wizard. When you do, Storyline will execute that script just like any other trigger action, whether it's pausing a timeline, opening a link, or performing a completely custom function. For example, you might use JavaScript to display the current date in a course certificate, generate a random quiz question, or even automatically pull the learner's name from their LMS profile and display it on screen. These are things that aren't built into the trigger wizard by default, but using JavaScript, you can expand Storyline's capabilities far beyond what's available through the standard menu. Before we move on, let's take a quick break and appreciate the real stars of this channel, the pugs. They may be known for snorting and stealing snacks, but did you know they also have a surprisingly heroic and slightly mischievous history? Napoleon's wife Josephine had a pug named Fortune who smuggled secret messages in his collar while she was imprisoned. And on their wedding night, Fortune refused to let Napoleon into the bed until Josephine said it was okay. Apparently, pugs have always been masters of setting boundaries. A pug named Pompey once saved Prince William the Silent by barking to warn him of assassins. The prince was so grateful that pugs became part of the Dutch royal coat of arms. Dixie says that makes her official royalty. And we're not arguing. In the 1700s, a secret society called the Order of the Pug was formed in Germany. Members wore pug medallions, called each other pug, and even barked during initiation. Everclear's on board, though he's still working on his secret handshake. So the next time you see a pug, remember, they're more than just snorting bundles of love and affection. They've been spies, heroes, and secret society icons too. XAPI, also known as Tin Can API, works a lot like SCORM. It's a way for your course to communicate with your learning management system, or LMS. The difference is in the level of detail. SCORM is great for tracking completion data, things like completed, passed, or failed. But XAPI takes that a step further by letting you capture custom data about what your learners actually do inside the course. So why would you use an XAPI statement? Let's say you're trying to figure out why your learners are struggling with the final knowledge check. SCORM will only tell you that they failed, but XAPI can tell you which specific questions they missed and what answers they selected. That kind of insight can help you spot if your question was unclear, misleading, or if your content didn't quite explain the concept well enough. In short, XAPI tracks actions, not just outcomes. Because this trigger can get a little complex, it's important to know exactly what you're trying to measure and report before you start adding it. When you create an XAPI trigger, the first step is to select the XAPI action. What you want, the LMS to know the learner did. You'll have 16 options to choose from: abandoned, answered, asked, attempted, commented, completed, experienced, failed, interacted, passed, progressed, satisfied, terminated, viewed, and waived. Once you've selected the action, you'll tie it to a specific event. For example, did the learner complete a slide, interact with an object, or perform a specific task? Finally, if you know how to code, or if you found a reliable script online, you can click the +XAPI link to open the XAPI statement editor, where you can enter or customize your statement for reporting to the LMS. The last trigger in the More section is the print slide trigger. Let's say your organization doesn't have a formal LMS to track training completions, or maybe you're designing a course for external learners who need to show proof they've completed their annual training. You can create a slide that looks like a completion certificate, including the learner's name, course title, number of hours or CE credits, and the date. Then, by adding a button with the print slide trigger, you'll activate the browser's print function. This lets the learner print or save the certificate as a PDF and submit it for record keeping. It's a simple way to provide proof of completion when a formal tracking system isn't available. The last section in the trigger wizard is the quiz section, which includes 5 actions you can choose from: submit interaction, submit results, review results, reset results, and print results. Most likely, you probably will never use the trigger wizard to generate the submit interaction trigger and action. That doesn't mean you haven't created a submit interaction trigger. If you've ever inserted a quiz question, then you've created a submit interaction trigger because it's pre-programmed into the slide. This is part of the reason you see a Submit button instead of the Next button. Submitting an interaction tells Storyline to evaluate that specific question or activity. This applies not only to quiz slides like multiple choice or true-false, but also to custom-built graded interactions, such as drag and drops or hotspots. The Submit Results trigger is a bit more specialized. It connects to a results slide you've already added to your course, and its behavior depends on the type of quiz you've built and its purpose. For example, a pretest might use this trigger to determine if a learner can skip ahead, a knowledge check might simply show a score for self-assessment, and a final assessment will typically report the learner's score to your LMS. The Review Results trigger is also connected to the results slide. It allows learners to go back through their quiz and see which questions they got right or wrong. You can choose to display only incorrect responses or both correct and incorrect answers, depending on how much feedback you want to provide. For example, in a compliance training course, you may want learners to review both the correct and incorrect answers so they can identify where they need improvement before retaking the quiz. Reset Results does exactly what it sounds like. It clears Storyline's record of the learner's quiz attempt, letting them retake the quiz and potentially submit new results. A great example is a learner who didn't pass the first time and wants to try again. Clicking Retry Quiz activates this trigger, clearing the first attempt and giving them a clean slate. The final trigger is Print Results. This one opens a new browser window and displays the learner's questions and responses. From there, they can print a hard copy or save the page as a PDF, perfect for learners who need a record of completion or want to review their answers later. However, use this trigger sparingly. If your quiz contains proprietary questions or answers, learners could print and share that information with others, giving them an unfair advantage on their own attempts. Thank you for spending the last few minutes and for watching this week's video helping you to learn Articulate Storyline. We hope you found it useful and valuable. If you did, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. If there is something about Storyline you want to learn more about, please let us know in the comments. The Pug Grumble says, "Thank you and have a great day."